There is a strange paradox in our lives. We have houses filled with furniture, devices that connect us instantly across the world, and calendars packed with things to do. Yet deep inside, many of us feel strangely homeless. It's not the lack of a roof over our heads, it's the lack of a roof over our hearts. You see, from the moment we wake up, our minds are already racing. We're checking messages, rushing through breakfast, chasing deadlines, worrying about bills, scrolling endlessly through feeds that never seem to end. Our bodies may sit in one place, but our minds are scattered, one moment stuck in the past, another moment lost in the future. We are like travelers who never stop traveling, always moving, always searching, always hoping the next thing will finally bring us peace. And yet, no matter how much we run, something is missing. Something feels unsettled, restless, incomplete. That feeling is the quiet ache of being away from home. Now, when I say home, I don't mean the house you grew up in or the apartment you pay rent for. I mean the inner sanctuary where the mind can finally rest, where the heart feels safe, and where the soul no longer needs to chase after anything. A home that does not depend on possessions or status, but on presence. But here's the tragedy. We have forgotten where that home is. We have become strangers to ourselves. Imagine a bird that flies from tree to tree, searching desperately for a place to land, yet never realizing its own wings were meant to carry it back to its nest. That's us. Constantly chasing, endlessly longing, and never pausing long enough to see that the way home has always been within reach. The Buddha once compared the restless mind to a monkey, always jumping from branch to branch, never still, never satisfied. And isn't that exactly what modern life feels like? Our monkey mind clings to one thought, swings to the next, and before we even notice, an entire day has passed in a blur. But what if the way back home wasn't complicated? What if the door had been open all along? What if all it takes is a breath? Take a moment right now. Inhale gently. Feel the air filling your lungs. Hold it. Exhale slowly. Notice how your body softens just a little. Did you feel it? In that single breath, for just a moment, you were home. This is the forgotten truth. Returning to the breath is returning home. The breath is not just oxygen. It is life itself. It is the bridge between body and mind, the rhythm that carries us from birth until our final moment. And yet, because it is so close, so ordinary, we overlook it. We search for peace in grand ideas, in distant places, in achievements and recognition, when the simplest key has always been right here. One mindful breath. To come home is not to escape the world. It is not to abandon responsibilities or withdraw from life. To come home is to rediscover a way of being calm, grounded, awake, no matter where you are or what you are facing. It is the art of being fully present in this very moment. And the doorway to that art is always the breath. As we begin this journey together, let us pause and remember, the home we long for is not somewhere outside of us. It is here. It is now. It is waiting patiently beneath the noise, beneath the rushing, beneath the endless demands. The first step back is simple. We learn to breathe not as a mechanical act, but as a sacred act. Each inhale arriving, each exhale resting. This is where our journey begins, with the forgotten home, a place we've overlooked but never lost. And if we follow this path, one breath at a time, we may discover something extraordinary. That home has always been closer than we ever imagined. When we think of home, most of us picture a building. 4 walls, a roof, a bed, maybe the smell of familiar food drifting from the kitchen. A place where we return after a long day, where we shut the door on the noise of the world. But the home spoken of in the teachings of the Buddha is something far deeper, far more essential. It is not a structure built of wood or stone. It is not defined by an address or a set of keys. This home cannot be taken away by fire, flood, or foreclosure. It is the home of the heart. In Buddhism, home is that state of being where the mind no longer wanders restlessly, where it no longer clings or runs away. It is the place where awareness settles into the present, like a lake so still that the moon is reflected perfectly on its surface. Think about it. How many times have you been in your own house but felt utterly unsettled inside? Surrounded by comfort, yet still restless, still lonely, still searching for something unnamed. That's because home in its deepest sense is not a physical location, it is a way of being. True home is the ground beneath our thoughts, the space behind our emotions. It is the place where nothing is missing because in that moment of presence everything is whole. Let me tell you a story. There was once a man who spent his entire life searching for peace. He traveled from one land to another, climbed mountains, crossed oceans, met teachers, read books, performed rituals. Each time he thought he had found the answer, it slipped away like sand falling through his fingers. Exhausted, he returned to his village, to the small hut he had grown up in. One evening, while sitting quietly in his garden, he noticed his breath rising, falling. In that simple awareness, he felt a peace deeper than anything he had ever found abroad. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "All this time I was already home." This is the heart of the teaching. The home we search for is not outside of us, it is within us. The Buddha called this state sati, mindfulness, presence, awareness. It is what allows us to live fully in each moment instead of being dragged into the storms of past and future. When we rest in mindfulness, we are home. But why call it home? Because just like a true home, this inner state offers shelter. When anger comes, mindfulness is the roof that keeps us from burning. When fear arises, mindfulness is the warm fire that reminds us we are safe. When loneliness knocks at the door, mindfulness whispers, "You are already whole." Home is not perfection. It is not a place where pain never exists. Pain will come just as storms come to every house. But when we live in mindfulness, we no longer fear the storm because we know there is a stillness within that cannot be touched. And here lies the most beautiful truth. You don't need to go anywhere to return home. You don't need money, power, or special circumstances. You don't even need anyone else to open the door for you. Your breath is the key, your presence is the doorway, and your awareness is the house itself. Can you feel the shift? The moment you close your eyes, take a conscious breath, and allow yourself to simply be, you are home. This is why the great Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh often reminded his students, breathing in, I arrive. Breathing out, I am home. Not someday, not somewhere else, but here, now. So perhaps the question is not, what is home, but rather, why do we keep forgetting it? If home is always within us, why do we feel so far away from it? Why, even surrounded by comfort, do so many of us carry the silent ache of restlessness, as if something essential is missing? The answer is simple yet painful: we forget. Our minds are like restless travelers. One moment they're replaying an old mistake from years ago, filled with regret and shame. The next moment they're racing ahead, worrying about a future that hasn't even arrived. We drift between the past and the future like a boat cut loose from its anchor, never resting in the calm harbor of the present. Think about it. Have you ever been eating dinner but your mind is somewhere else, replaying an argument, worrying about tomorrow's meeting, scrolling through your phone without even tasting the food in front of you? Your body is at the table but your heart is absent. That is what it means to be homeless in your own life. We are homeless not because we lack shelter, but because we lack presence. Modern life makes this even harder. We live in a world of endless noise. Notifications, deadlines, advertisements, entertainment, each one pulling at our attention, scattering it into 1,000 pieces. And with every distraction, we drift further from ourselves. It is no wonder we feel so tired. It is exhausting to live everywhere except here. The Buddha once described human craving as a fire. We run from one desire to the next, hoping the next achievement, the next possession, the next relationship will finally make us feel whole. And yet, like pouring salt water on thirst, the more we consume, the thirstier we become. This is the tragedy of forgetting our true home. We look for peace outside, but outside only multiplies our longing. We chase after external houses, while our inner house remains locked and abandoned. Let me tell you a story. There was a young woman who moved to the city, determined to build a successful life. She worked long hours, earned money, bought expensive clothes, filled her apartment with things she thought would prove she had made it. And yet every night she would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling a hollow ache she could not explain. One day while walking in the park, She noticed an elderly monk sitting quietly on a bench. He wasn't doing anything spectacular, just breathing, smiling, completely at peace. Curious, she asked, "How can you sit here with nothing and yet look happier than me with everything I have?" Monk replied, "Because you have a house, but you have no home. I have no house, but I am always at home." That is the difference. We feel homeless because we confuse our house for our home, our possessions for our peace, our busyness for our worth. And in chasing all of these, we lose touch with the very ground of our being, the simple breath, the simple presence, the simple awareness that is always here. But here's the hope. Being homeless in spirit is not permanent. The path home is never far away. In fact, it's as close as your next breath. The question is, will we remember to return? If being homeless in our own lives comes from forgetfulness, then what is the doorway back? The answer is astonishingly simple: the breath. The breath is the most faithful companion we will ever have. From the moment we are born until the moment we take our final leave, the breath never abandons us. It flows quietly, steadily, asking nothing, giving everything. And yet most of the time we barely notice it. But in Buddhist practice, the breath is not just air moving in and out of the lungs. It is the bridge between body and mind. Think about it. When you're anxious, your breathing becomes shallow and fast. When you're calm, it slows down, deep and steady. The mind affects the breath, and the breath affects the mind. They are not two separate things, but one continuous flow. The Buddha understood this thousands of years ago. In the Anapanasati Sutta, the discourse on mindfulness of breathing, he taught a simple yet profound practice. Observe the breath gently without trying to control it. Just be aware. Breathing in, know you are breathing in. Breathing out, know you are breathing out. That's all. At first glance, it seems almost too simple. Could something so ordinary really transform our lives? But that is the beauty of it. Because the breath is always here. It becomes the perfect anchor to bring us back to the present moment. Let me share an image. Picture a kite dancing in the wind. The string holds it steady, preventing it from being blown away. Without the string, the kite is lost to the sky. Our minds are like that kite, tossed around by thoughts, emotions, and distractions. The breath is the string. It grounds us, anchors us, connects us to this very moment. There's also a profound tenderness in realizing that each breath is a gift. Every inhale is life entering us anew. Every exhale is life letting go, teaching us impermanence. With every cycle, we are reminded that nothing is permanent, not joy, not sorrow, not even the breath itself. This awareness softens the heart, humbles the ego, and awakens gratitude. And here's something extraordinary. When you breathe with awareness, body and mind reunite. No longer is the body sitting at the desk while the mind wanders through worries. No longer is the body eating while the mind scrolls through endless screens. In that breath, you are whole again, present, alive. I once heard the story of a soldier who returned from war, haunted by memories he could not escape. Night after night, he woke in terror, reliving the battlefield. His teacher told him, "When the past overwhelms you, return to your breath. Each inhale tells you, this is not then, this is now. Each exhale tells you, you are safe, you are home." Slowly, breath by breath, he began to heal. This is the miracle of the breath. It does not erase our wounds, but it gives us a ground to stand on while we learn to live with them. It does not promise a life without storms, but it gives us shelter when storms arrive. The breath is not just a biological function. It is a spiritual bridge, uniting body and mind, uniting the present with eternity, uniting us with the deepest truth of who we are. So the next time you feel scattered, lost, or homeless inside, remember, the bridge is already here. All it takes is one conscious breath to cross back over. And once we discover this bridge, a new question arises. Where does it lead us? What happens when we step onto it fully and allow the breath to guide us into the heart of the present moment? Present moment. It sounds so ordinary, so simple that we often dismiss it. Yet it is the only place where life truly happens. Think about it. The past is already gone, carved into memory. The future has not yet arrived, a landscape of possibilities we cannot touch. The only reality we ever have is here now, this very breath. And yet, how often do we miss it? We live as if the present were just a bridge to somewhere else. We rush through mornings to get to work, rush through work to get to evening, rush through evenings to get to rest, only to wake up and rush again. Always on the way to something, never fully here. But the present moment is not a stepping stone, it is the destination. The Buddha once said, "Do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment." This was not a poetic suggestion. It was a direct path to freedom. Because when we return to the present moment, suffering begins to dissolve. Why? Because most of our suffering doesn't actually come from what is happening right now. It comes from what our minds are doing. Regret chains us to what cannot be changed. Fear chains us to what has not yet come. But in the present, most of the time, we are okay. We are breathing. We are alive. We are safe. Let me give you an example. A man once confessed that his life was filled with anxiety. He worried constantly about losing his job, about his health, about what people thought of him. His teacher asked, "At this very moment as you sit here, what is wrong?" The man paused. He realized nothing was wrong. His fears were about tomorrow. His regrets were about yesterday, but right now, he was simply sitting, breathing, alive. That realization was a doorway. The breath is what helps us walk through that doorway. Each inhale anchors us. Each exhale releases what pulls us away. With every mindful breath, we step back into the only reality we can ever truly touch, the present. Try it for yourself. Close your eyes, inhale gently. Feel the air entering, the chest rising, the belly expanding. Exhale slowly, notice the soft release, the body easing. For those few seconds, did you notice how everything else, worries, plans, regrets, faded to the background? That is the power of returning. And here's the secret. The present moment is not just neutral. It holds treasures we constantly overlook. The laughter of a child, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the simple miracle that your heart is still beating right now. When you live in the present, life becomes vivid, alive, luminous. You begin to see wonders in places you once thought were ordinary. I once heard a Zen saying, "The miracle is not to walk on water, the miracle is to walk on the earth." When you are fully present, even a single step, even a single breath becomes a miracle. And slowly, as you return again and again, you realize, home is not a distant place. It is this moment. Home is the cup of tea in your hands, the sound of the wind in the trees, the gentle rhythm of your breath reminding you that you belong here. But there is more. When we truly rest in the present, something begins to heal. The mind quiets, the heart softens, the body relaxes, and this leads us to the next discovery. The breath is not only an anchor, it is medicine, a source of deep healing both for the body and the soul. Have you ever noticed what happens to your breath when you are afraid? It becomes shallow, fast, almost jagged. And when you are calm, the breath deepens, flowing like a quiet stream. This is no coincidence. The breath and the state of the mind are inseparable. They mirror each other. Change one and you begin to change the other. That is why the breath is not just an anchor, it is medicine. Modern science has confirmed what the Buddha taught more than 500 years ago. When we breathe slowly and mindfully, the body activates what doctors call the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's natural rest and heal mode. Heart rate slows, blood pressure lowers, muscles relax, stress hormones decrease. In other words, a single mindful breath begins to repair us. But healing through the breath goes far beyond the physical. When anger rises, the breath is often the first to burn. If we catch it, if we return to breathing deeply and slowly, anger softens. When sorrow weighs heavy, mindful breathing becomes like a hand gently holding the heart, reminding us that we are still alive, still capable of peace. The breath is a medicine chest we carry everywhere, yet rarely open. Let me share a story. A young man once came to his teacher in despair. His life felt broken. Family conflict, pressure at work, sleepless nights haunted by worry. He asked for a solution, something grand, something powerful to end his suffering. The teacher simply said, "Sit down, breathe." The young man was frustrated. "That's it, just breathe." The teacher smiled and replied, "Do not underestimate a single mindful breath. It has saved lives." And indeed it did. Each day the young man practiced. One mindful breath when anger rose. One mindful breath before answering a harsh email. One mindful breath when lying awake at night. Slowly, he discovered a space inside himself that no chaos could reach. His problems didn't vanish, but he began to heal from the inside. This is the hidden strength of the breath. It doesn't erase the storms of life, but it gives us shelter within them. The Buddha taught this very clearly in the Anapanasati Sutta. By practicing mindfulness of breathing, he said, we can purify the mind, calm the body, release suffering, and even touch awakening itself. Every breath becomes a step on the path of liberation. Sometimes, healing comes in the simplest way. Imagine standing in a garden after rain. You close your eyes, breathe in the fragrance of wet earth, breathe out the tension of the day. For a moment, everything feels lighter. That moment is medicine. So often we look for healing outside, in doctors, in pills, in escapes, in distractions. And while those may have their place, the truth is that a source of profound healing is already with us. We carry it every second of our lives. All we need is to remember it. Breathing in, we nourish the body. Breathing out, we release the toxins of stress and fear. Breathing in, we invite peace. Breathing out, we let go of pain. This is not just technique. It is a way of loving ourselves, a way of caring for this fragile yet miraculous life. And yet, healing is only part of the story. The breath also teaches us something deeper, something even more liberating. With every inhale and exhale, it whispers a profound truth. Everything is impermanent, everything is free to change. And in that truth lies freedom itself. Every breath is a teacher. Every inhale, every exhale whispers a truth we often forget: nothing lasts forever. When you breathe in, the air enters, fills your lungs, nourishes your body. Then whether you want to or not, you must let it go. You cannot hold it. You cannot cling to it. To live, you must release. This is impermanence made visible, tangible, undeniable. And yet, isn't this the very thing we struggle against every day? We cling to success, relationships, possessions, even to identities, as if holding on tightly could stop them from changing. But the breath shows us otherwise. Clinging only suffocates. Letting go is where freedom begins. The Buddha often described liberation not as gaining something new, but as releasing what binds us. And the breath trains us in this art of release. With every exhale, we practice surrender. We practice trust. We practice freedom. Let me tell you a story. A man once came to a Zen master, burdened by worry. He said, "I cannot let go. My thoughts, my fears, my attachments, they chain me." The master asked him to take a deep breath and hold it. The man did. After a few seconds, his face turned red. His chest grew tight. His body trembled. Finally, gasping, he exhaled. The master smiled and said, "See, letting go is not something to fear. It is what keeps you alive." That is the lesson of the breath. Freedom is not in clinging. It is in releasing. But freedom is not only about letting go of what hurts us. It is also about arriving fully in what is here. When we breathe mindfully, we are no longer prisoners of the past or captives of the future. We are free from the illusions that drag us away. For those few sacred moments, we taste true freedom, the freedom of being fully alive. Notice how children breathe. Watch a baby sleeping, belly rising and falling in natural rhythm. They are not planning tomorrow, not replaying yesterday. They are simply here. That is innocence, that is freedom. Somewhere along the way, we forgot this simplicity, but the breath can lead us back. And here's the paradox. In returning to the breath, we discover a home that is not fixed, not bound, not limited. It is a home built on freedom itself. Because to be at home in the breath is to realize you don't need to hold on to anything else. You don't need life to be different in order to rest in peace. Freedom is not in escaping life. It is in embracing it, exactly as it is, breath by breath. So the next time you inhale, try to notice, this moment is enough. The next time you exhale, remember, you can let go. With each cycle, the chains grow lighter, the heart grows freer, the mind grows clearer. And once we have touched even a glimpse of this freedom, a question naturally arises. How can we carry it into the ordinary moments of our busy lives? How can this practice move from the cushion into the chaos of work, relationships, traffic, and daily struggles? The answer is waiting, woven into every moment of living. It is one thing to sit quietly, breathing in the stillness of a quiet room. But what about when the phone rings, when deadlines pile up, when traffic blares and children cry? Can the breath still be our refuge then? The truth is, if mindfulness of breathing cannot follow us into daily life, then it is only half a practice. The real beauty begins when every ordinary moment becomes an invitation to return home. Think of the morning. The alarm clock goes off. Instinctively, you may reach for your phone. But what if, before touching it, you took just one deep, mindful breath? Inhale the gift of a new day. Exhale the heaviness of yesterday. That single breath can set the tone for everything that follows. Or imagine standing in line at the grocery store. Most people scroll, sigh, or grow impatient. But here is a secret. Waiting is a perfect time to breathe. Instead of being trapped in frustration, you can feel your feet on the ground, your lungs expanding and releasing. Suddenly, waiting becomes resting. A mindful breath can change the way we speak. Before replying to a harsh word, pause, breathe. That pause is not weakness, it is wisdom. It transforms reaction into response, chaos into clarity. One mindful breath can save a relationship. Even walking can be transformed. Instead of rushing from place to place, try synchronizing steps with breathing. Inhale, step. Exhale, step. Suddenly, the world slows down. The ground beneath your feet feels more alive. Each step becomes a gentle return home. The Buddha once said, "When walking, know you are walking. When breathing, know you are breathing." It sounds so simple, yet in that simplicity lies profound freedom. To truly know you are breathing is to live without being lost. There's a story of a monk who was once asked how he found time for practice amid endless responsibilities. He smiled and said, "When I eat, I eat. When I walk, I walk. When I breathe, that is enough." His secret was not in doing more, but in doing what was already there with presence. And here is the beauty. You do not need hours of meditation to live like this. You need only moments. One mindful breath before a meeting. One mindful breath before opening a difficult conversation. One mindful breath before bed. Slowly, these moments weave together, forming a life lived with awareness. Think of the breath as a gentle bell that rings throughout your day. Each time you hear it, you remember, I am here, I am alive, I am home. When mindfulness becomes part of daily life, healing and freedom are no longer experiences reserved for special moments. They flow through everything. Washing dishes becomes meditation. Driving becomes meditation. Even moments of conflict or sorrow become opportunities to return to the breath. This is the promise of practice, that peace is never far away. It is always one breath close. And as you begin to taste this way of living, another realization starts to blossom. The breath is not only for your own healing. When you breathe with awareness, when you live with presence, something radiates outward. The people around you feel it. Your calm becomes their calm. Your peace becomes their refuge. That is the power of the breath, not only to transform your life, but to touch the lives of others. And from this truth arises a deeper question. If the breath can connect us to ourselves and to those around us, can it also connect us to something greater? Can it reveal the interconnection of all life? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. An entire room filled with people breathing as one. Inhale together. Exhale together. No words, no roles, no divisions. Just breathe, flowing in unison, weaving invisible threads between every heart in the room. That is the power of collective breathing. It reminds us that while each of us has our own body, our own mind, the very air we breathe is shared. The same oxygen that fills your lungs in this moment will travel into mine in the next. The breath does not belong to you nor to me. It belongs to all of us. The Buddha often reminded his students that we are interdependent beings. This is because that is, he said. The air we breathe carries the truth of this teaching. A tree exhales oxygen, we inhale it. We exhale carbon dioxide, the tree inhales it. Life is a continuous exchange, a circle of giving and receiving. When we breathe together, we touch this reality. Have you ever noticed what happens when someone near you is calm? Their breathing slows and suddenly your own breath begins to mirror theirs. Science calls it entrainment. Our bodies naturally sync with those around us. In truth, this is compassion in action, lived through breath. One calm breath can calm a family. One mindful breath can steady a crowd. Let me share a story. After a devastating natural disaster, survivors gathered in a makeshift shelter. Anxiety filled the air, children crying, adults whispering fears, everyone restless. Then one elder began to guide the group. Let us breathe together. At first, only a few followed, but soon dozens of people inhaled and exhaled in unison. The crying softened. The panic eased. In that fragile moment, collective breathing created a sanctuary, proof that even in suffering, community can breathe peace into being. Breathing together is more than practice. It is a declaration we belong to one another. In a world that often emphasizes separation, your race, your nation, my nation, the breath dissolves those walls. Because truly, what border can stop the air? In times of conflict, division, or despair, imagine what could happen if leaders, communities, even families paused to breathe together. It would not erase disagreements, but it might remind us of our shared humanity. Before we are anything else, before success or failure, before identity or status, we are breathing beings. To breathe with another person is to say, I see you. I share this life with you. It is the simplest act of solidarity, the most silent form of love. When we gather in meditation halls, when we chant or sit quietly together, the collective breath becomes a collective home, a place where no one is excluded, where peace is not just an individual achievement but a shared experience. And here lies a beautiful truth. The breath teaches us that our personal practice is never just personal. Every mindful breath you take sends ripples into the world. Your peace nurtures the peace of others. Their peace returns to you. We heal not in isolation but together. So as you breathe, remember, you are not alone. You are part of a vast, breathing family, the family of life itself. And this brings us to a final reflection. If breathing together reveals our collective home, what does it mean to return fully and completely to that home? To rest not only in our own breath, but in the breath of the universe itself. Home is not a destination. It is not a place we must travel miles to reach. It is not hidden in the past, nor waiting in the future. Home is here, woven into the rhythm of the breath, present in this very moment. Every inhale is an arrival. Every exhale is a release. Together they form a gentle reminder you are already home. But here's the paradox we forget again and again. We lose ourselves in the noise, in the rush, in the weight of worries and desires. And that is okay. Forgetting is part of being human. What matters is not that we wander, but that we return. That is why the practice is called returning. Not achieving, not conquering, not possessing, simply returning to the breath, to the body, to the present, to the truth that we are alive right now. Think of the ocean. Waves rise and fall endlessly, yet beneath them the deep water remains still. Our lives are like those waves, busy, restless, ever-changing. But when we return to the breath, we sink beneath the surface, touching the stillness that has always been there. That stillness is home. The Buddha once said, breathing in, I calm body and mind. Breathing out, I dwell in the present moment. This is the only moment. What more do we need than this? To breathe, to dwell, to be. And as you hear these words, take a moment now. Inhale slowly. Feel the air enter, cool and fresh. Exhale gently. Release what you no longer need. This is it. This is coming home. The beauty of the breath is that it never leaves you. Wherever you go, whatever happens, the breath is your companion, your refuge, your reminder that peace is always just one mindful inhale and exhale away. So do not wait for the perfect moment, the perfect retreat, the perfect silence. Begin here. Begin now. Return home with this breath. And when you forget, return again and again and again. For home is not a single arrival. It is a continuous journey. Every return deepens your peace, your freedom, your compassion. Every return reminds you that you were never truly lost. You only needed to remember. And so the journey ends exactly where it began, with the breath, coming home again and again. If this journey has touched something within you, if the simple act of returning to the breath felt like coming home, then I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, and let us continue walking this path together, breath by breath, story by story. May each video be a gentle reminder that peace is never far away. It is always here, waiting in the rhythm of your own breath.